Thank you all. There's so many ideas and information. We'll try to break it down, not necessarily by the order of the insights and your analysis. But I would like to start with you, Dr. Schueftan. Whatever I've heard from you, I've heard in all our mutual trips at the shuttle to DuPont Circle. So this is not new for me. And I will tell you like that. We take the shuttle, yeah. So I agree with you that Israel or the results of the elections cannot influence the developments, say, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, where we see a lot of political movement recently. But there is at least one channel where it can, and which is in an absolute deadlock. And of course, I talk about the peace process here. So two parts of this question. In such a dynamic times in this region, are not the risks of stalemate are higher than those of action, at least with regard to the Palestinian issue? And on that note, assuming that Netanyahu's Likud Beiten wins the election and forms a right-wing religious coalition, what implications will it have on the peace process?
Well, first, let us acknowledge that what nations do is not a product of calculating the advantages and disadvantages of action and inaction. I mean, this is if we waste our lives being in universities and being analytical, which is what I've done, then this is the perception of what you do. You weigh the advantages and disadvantages, and then you say, well, I'll take where the disadvantage, but that's not the way it works. Other than that, it's great. I mean, writing articles and books on the subject is great, but this is now not how decisions are taken. I don't think that, and all three of us are in agreement here, that a macro agreement about the Palestinian issue can be reached. And we may differ on the question, where is the center of gravity here? I tend to learn from the fact that it was rejected in Camp David and the 2008 Olmert propositions were rejected. And I'm saying that the fact that it's rejected now is not only a product of the fact that it's a right-wing government and that they're not offered. There is something much more fundamental. I can say what I believe an Israeli government should do and will not do. Okay? And it's basically the following, that and this is what I've offered 4 years ago, so I may not have 16 points, but it's still, I have a point, which is, you know, also, basically 4 years ago, if I were the Prime Minister of Israel, and I wouldn't recommend it for Israel, but if I were the Prime Minister of Israel, I would approach the President of the United States, and I would say the following. You are obsessed with negotiations. Let's have negotiations. It makes Americans happy. But let me tell you something, Mr. President, nothing will come out of it. Now, do you mind if while we're negotiating, Israel will unilaterally dismantle the occupation? Do you mind? I don't think he would have rejected it out of hand. And then I would offer the following. Let us start transferring territory from Area C to Area B and from Area B to Area A and try to do it in a contiguous way. And I would ask the President of the United States, because I'm not negotiating with the Palestinians, that's a waste of time. I'm negotiating with the United States. I would like the President of the United States to promise me 3 things. A, to get the UN and the Europeans off my back so that serious steps can be taken. B, to accept that Israel completes the fence, because without it you cannot withdraw from very large territories, and I mean including around the settlement blocks. And C, not to become involved in where I withdraw, but to leave that to domestic Israeli considerations. As an Israeli Prime Minister, I would start with the Kahanist settlements and hope they will shoot at Israeli soldiers. That would be very helpful, I think, in Israel public opinion. Just I would give them the guns and the ammunition and just persuade them to take one shot. I think that's enough to make it much easier in Israel. And then realize that we are not about to solve the problem. For instance, we are not touching the Jordan Valley. Because as long as we don't know what's happening in Jordan, no responsible prime minister, from the right or from the left, will take any decisions whatsoever. So if you say, do it, it will be sovereign and schmovereign and so on, the beauty of unilateralism, which I advocate for decades, and I advocate it in Jerusalem. I advocate the repartitioning of Jerusalem along different lines, more or less the Clinton approach in Jerusalem. I would say leave all that and concentrate on one thing, and this is rooting out the settlements outside the perimeter of the defense fence and bringing them back either to Israel or to the settlement blocks, if this is what makes them happy. And this could be for a few years, and anybody who wants to plan for more than a few years, again, belongs in a university and not in a place where real decisions are being taken. For a few years, this is something that our generation in Israel has to deal with, namely the settlements outside the parameters of the settlement blocks. And for those of you who are not aware of the numbers, the settlement blocks are about 6% of the West Bank. Okay, so we're speaking about 94% of the West Bank, and that's a good beginning when you start evacuating settlements from these areas. And unlike the Gaza Strip, where I think the disengagement was a tremendous success, tremendous. And I knew before I advocated it that it will bring more terrorism and Hamas. But my judgment was an Israeli society without Gaza is stronger than an Israeli society with Gaza, and an Israeli society without Nablus is stronger than an Israeli society with Nablus, and an Israeli society without East Jerusalem is stronger than an Israeli society with East Jerusalem. So the one major difference between Gaza and the West Bank, you can't afford to take out the Israeli army from the West Bank while you're taking these steps. Because the one danger, and this is where I will stop my proposition, the one danger that I'm frightened of more than anything else is that we withdraw from the Gaza Strip and then we have to reoccupy it. Because if we have to reoccupy it, then it's over. Then we are stuck there forever. So this is what I would do. Will it be done? No. The problem is the leadership isn't there. The kind of leadership that Sharon had and Olmert tried to get but couldn't is not available at that moment. We have a crisis of leadership, by the way, in all democratic societies. It is not specific only for Israel. And the kind of leadership you need. You know, when Sharon came to the Israeli public and he said, this was his slogan in 2003, I believe, only Sharon can bring peace. He could rest assured that Israelis understand what Sharon peace means. Namely, they'll trust him not to make peace, but to make security in terms of that Israelis sometimes use. This kind of leadership is missing, and therefore, having lost Sharon and having lost Olmert, which could have tried along the same way, is something that we are suffering the consequences of at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I want to shift to the other side, go a bit out of Israel into the Palestinian street. How close does the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian street, the people in Ramallah, in Tulkarem, follow the elections in Israel? How worried are the people in light of the prospects of facing 4 more years of an incapable government when it comes to the peace process, as Dr. Schueftan has mentioned?
I think they don't follow it too closely. I mean, except for the buffs, for those who are really professionally following it, they don't follow it closely. And that's because the sense is they're all the same. Barak was bad, Sharon was bad, Olmert was bad, and Bibi was bad. There isn't that sense of differentiation between the various parties. Now, this is a product of many things. It's a product of the lack of progress. It's the product of the lack of faith and belief that you talked about. It's a progress of the kind of messaging they hear from their different leaderships, whether in the PA or in Gaza or in the political system. So there is really no differentiation. Israel is Israel. Differentiation comes when the results start happening or when failure occurs. And this is, again, where it becomes important to see how the next Israeli government is going to behave. I mean, you talked about stalemate versus progress. There's a third option, and that's failure. And failure comes with a price. And I think for the Palestinians, that is one of the issues that they would keep an eye on. If something like what Dan has proposed starts being put into place, I suspect the Palestinian public will start paying attention. The leaders might not like it. I mean, I remember Gaza. And I was not a big fan of the Gaza withdrawal, and I still am not in the way it was done. But as we at the leadership, and I was an official at that point, were worried about the political and diplomatic implications, people in Gaza were ecstatic because things are moving. If we start seeing motion in the West Bank, similar to what you described, then I suspect the Palestinian public will start paying attention to the Israelis. Otherwise, I think you will see, what's the word, ennui in terms of dealing with the Israeli political establishment. And that is the same one, frankly, that follows with the whole peace process. People are tired of it. They don't want violence. The intifada is still fresh. The wounds are still fresh. But at the same time, no one's holding their breath in terms of expecting any breakthrough, and the same lack of connection, if you wish, or lack of trust between the public and their political leaderships, and frankly, anything political right now, will continue. And to me, this is a very scary, volatile situation.
So I want to continue on that point before I move on to Ambassador Ross. The other day, I was listening to an Israeli journalist who said that the lack of progress in the talks between Israel and the Palestinians resembles a man who decides to jump from a 50-story building in New York City. And when he reaches the 40th floor, he looks down and he says, so far, everything is okay. So I want to ask you, when you speak to your Palestinian colleagues, when you smell the Palestinian street, how close this metaphor to reality is? And the second part, are we en route, and you talk about this volatile condition, a situation, towards another collision, a third Palestinian uprising, an intifada, or even worse, towards a Palestinian war of independence? That's also something I've heard. So, please.
Yeah. Let's see, where do we start with this one?
The 41st floor, maybe?
41st floor. Continuing on the theme that Dan started, I mean, neither in Arabic nor in Hebrew is there, a homegrown word for strategy. We don't do it. The Palestinians don't do it, the Israelis don't do it, no one thinks in these terms. So the 40th floor, till you hit the ground, that is someone else's problem. And I suspect this is what you see in terms of the political behavior of the leaders. We see, I think, the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Palestinians leading both places to a place where what you described is true. The paradigm of two-state solution collapses. We might be going to where Dennis started mentioning, the whole religious versus nationalist. But frankly, with very few exceptions on both systems, I would say a strategic argument doesn't really get much traction in terms of influencing day-to-day behavior. It is more led by political considerations and tactical security ones than by strategic ones. Would it lead to a third intifada? I mean, one of the problems with volatility that we see there and we see elsewhere is a volatile situation can continue for a year or two or three, and the volatility deepens, but it's actually sustainable, and it could blow up in your face tomorrow. And there's no way for us analysts and for anyone working it in predicting what the trigger is. So you're always going on this uncertainty. So I'm not going to predict, but I'm going to tell you that the situation is ripe. It's ripe for something. What is this something? I don't know, and frankly, I don't care, because there are three options. There is an option of an intifada against Israel, violence against Israel. There's an option of the Arab Spring coming to Ramallah and against the PA and institutions, and the option of basically deflation of the PA, a collapse of the PA, call it as you will, that would create a political vacuum. These three scenarios bleed into one another and in the end are the same. What will start now against Israel, I just don't see a PA that is strong enough right now to withstand the pushback that will come. We're not in the post-Arafat or when Arafat was there and things were under control. If it starts against the PA and the PA collapses, I simply do not know how Israel will be shielded from this. So it is this kind of volatility, and that's where, again, I feel that there is, people can ignore it as they're doing right now, because frankly, so far, ignoring it has not produced that many negative effects until the moment that it hits, and when it hits, then it's anyone's guess.
Okay, thank you. I want to continue a little bit more on the peace process and raise a question to Ambassador Ross, and I want to read you something, Ambassador Ross. Part of the Israeli ethos is readiness to make serious, far-reaching concessions when it is clear they have a real partner. Rings a bell?
Yes.
Okay.
I think they're golden words,
the missing piece, page 28.
Yes.
So I mentioned in the previous panel that a poll that was commissioned by the Daniel Abrams Center for Middle East Peace, according to which more than 75% of Israelis are willing to end the conflict based on the two-state solutions. That's something that implies towards a general public belief among Israel that there is a Palestinian partner, there is someone to deal with out there. So why have we reached this ebb regarding the peace process, and what can be done to revive the process?
Look, I think we reached it because of what I was saying before. There is a sense on the Palestinian side, there's a sense that, look, this process began the Oslo process began in 1993. And they say, here we are, this is the 20th year. And what's changed for us? Their attitude is not much. And to the extent to which things have changed, it isn't for the better from their standpoint. They see, we may view settlements not as the thing that sort of makes it impossible to have a peace process, but from their standpoint, settlement building is an indication that the Israelis can do what they want and the Palestinians can't. And the Israelis can impose on them, and they are just supposed to take it. So that kind of impact on them is, I would say it is a very destructive impact, and it has fostered the sense of disbelief. The polls, by the way, that you cite, again, the companion to it is that, but nobody who says they're in favor of it believes it's going to happen on the Israeli side. Why is it that there's a mirror image? Because they say, look, we have withdrawn from territory twice, and what do we get? We withdrew from Lebanon, and what did we get? We withdrew from Gaza, and what did we get? We don't get land for peace. We don't get land for security. We get land for violence. So why should we think that if we were to withdraw from the West Bank, we're not going to see the same thing take place there, only that becomes really existential because it touches literally every Israeli neighborhood and city. So you have, each side they can completely justify why they see things the way they do. And my point is that, and here's, we're very much, I think actually all three of us are on the same wavelength. Mm-hmm. The idea that you're going to have a status quo that remains static is an illusion. It won't. Things will get worse. And what Ray said about, no one can sit up here and tell you, gee, there's going to be a third intifada. And yet, tomorrow there could be a spark. You look at the first intifada. It was a car accident in Gaza, and it triggered it. If you have enough frustration, you don't know, what particular combustible set of circumstances suddenly ignite. Mm-hmm. Maybe there'll be no intifada for the foreseeable future, maybe for multiple years. But let's say it doesn't happen. What is going to happen in the meantime is the future identity of the Palestinians is going to be reshaped and reframed. The survivability of the Palestinian Authority will be at stake. If the Palestinian Authority didn't exist, we would want to create it. If it collapses, it won't be so easy to recreate. So the idea that you can sit back and be comfortable and let it happen is, I think, a wonderful way of inviting the worst possible set of circumstances later on when it's too late to do anything about it. All right, so now I'm at the point, so what do you do about it? And I think what you do about it is you have to come up with what I would call an agenda for discussions. Here is where I basically am, I have a lot of, I have a lot of commonality with both Dan and Ghaith, but I would focus on how do I build an agenda for discussions at a time when I know if we could produce the negotiations. If the negotiations began tomorrow, the two sides would talk past each other. You would have a dialogue or the death. Negotiations are not going to be a panacea. They may still be a vehicle for a solution, but they're not a panacea. So the question is, what do they say to each other? I'm not an enthusiast for unilateral steps unless they're coordinated, because the only thing that we've seen unilateralism produce is more unilateralism. And it hasn't been constructive, it's been destructive. So here are my 16 points. What's the logic of them? The logic is, if each side disbelieves in the other's commitment to two states, what can you do to have each side address the disbelief? And I don't want it to be unilateral steps that they're going to take. I want it to be an agenda for discussions, or at least an agenda for the U.S. to broker between the two sides, so that whatever is done actually has a mutual quality to it, even if it's done in a kind of parallel way. All right, on the Israeli side, to address the Palestinian disbelief, which is a function of two things, not just 20 years. It's that, one, Palestinians say, if the Israelis really believe in two states, why are they building in what would be our state? And two, the Israelis will never really surrender control. So I have 6 points for the Israelis, and I'm going to have 6 points for the Palestinians, and I'm going to have 4 points that are mutual. The Israeli points. One, offer compensation to any settler who's prepared to move back into Israel or into the blocks. Two, because again, this sends a signal. We're not about building in your area. We're going to only focus on what we consider to be part of our state. Two, start building housing for those who would leave. Same logic, but also it has an additional benefit within Israel. You talk to the Gaza settlers who were forced to leave, you'd be lucky to find one who thinks they were taken care of. Start that process now. Three, build only in the blocks. Now, Dan said there's 6%. I'll say the blocks. I think the Israelis will define, the Israeli government would define the blocks as being everything to the west of the security barrier, which is actually on 8% of the territory. Now, the Palestinians won't agree on the size of the blocks, but that's what negotiations are about. This right now is about creating an agenda that is designed to address each side's disbelief. So that's the third step for the Israelis. The fourth is open up Area C, which is 60.1% of the West Bank, and open it up for Palestinian economic activity and even ownership. You have 11 rock quarries that exist in the West Bank. They all exist in Area C, every one of them. Stone masonry is one of the bigger industries for the Palestinians, but there isn't a Palestinian ownership of any of the rock quarries because they don't have the access to Area C. Open up Area C for economic activity, including ownership. The fifth step is to change Area B, and I'm not against what you're suggesting about C.
Maybe you can just clarify what is
right.
A, B,
Area
and C.
C.
3 more points then.
Yeah. No, so the Area C, you have to understand. I negotiated all this, so for me it's like, this is like breathing. It's like, Area C is where the Israelis retain civil and security responsibility. Area B is where the Palestinians have civil responsibility for law and order, but not for overall security for dealing with terror. 21.7% of the West Bank. Palestinian security forces, meaning police, are there, but they deal only with law and order questions. Expand their presence and expand their responsibility. Everything they do today is already coordinated with the IDF. So expand the scope of what they do, because what my fourth step does is not only good economically for Palestinians, and what my fifth step does, they do the same thing in terms of signaling the Palestinians, look, as Israel, we don't want to govern you, we don't want to rule you, we don't want to control you, we don't want to occupy you. And we're beginning a process that's going to invest more and more in you. And that relates to the sixth step as well. The sixth step relates to Area A. Area A is 18.2% of the West Bank. And it's where the Palestinians have civil and security responsibility. Now, the Israelis, the IDF, and security forces still go back into Area A. Now, they don't do it for gratuitous reasons. They do it because they have security reasons to do it. Every time they do it, it's a reminder of who controls whom. It's a reminder of the one area where the Palestinians are supposed to have putative control, they don't. So my suggestion here is for the Israelis to create a very clear set of security criteria, which if the Palestinians meet it, the Israelis don't go back in. Now, my guess is in Ramallah and in Bethlehem, the Palestinians could meet those criteria very soon. In other parts of the West Bank, less so, not so. But at least you'd see a change. And this is designed to give Palestinians a reason to say, well, maybe, look, maybe there is something going on here after all. Now, I'll get to the mutual steps after I do the Palestinian steps. The Palestinian steps. What's the problem on the Palestinians? What's the problem that the Israelis have with the Palestinians? They don't believe they're for real. They don't believe they really believe in two states. And there's some ample reasons for them to think that. So these points are designed to address that. The first point is Palestinians should put Israel on a map. You want to find Israeli settlements on a Palestinian map? You got no problem. You want to find Israel on a Palestinian map? You got a big problem. It ain't there. Pretty hard to convince people you live in two states if they're not on a map. Now, you know, Palestinians have said to me, okay, will the Israelis agree to put us on a map? Because, by the way, the Israelis don't put the Palestinians on a map. And my answer is, this is an agenda for discussion. So the first thing is, make it clear you're prepared to put Israel on a map. The second point, start talking about two states for two peoples. You won't hear the Palestinians talk about two states for two peoples. I'm not saying they got to say Jewish state right now. I'm saying two states for two peoples. These are two national movements, two national identities. The two states are designed to address that. And there is no reason why Palestinians can't do that. And their reluctance to do it convinces the Israeli public that they're not for real. The third point for the Palestinians, stop the incitement. Not every Palestinian who killed an Israeli is a martyr. Stop naming squares for them. And don't give the excuse of, well, it's the local city council that does that. Because there is no indication the Palestinian Authority opposes this whatsoever. You know, all you have to do is read anything coming out of the Palestinian Authority in terms of, you know, blaming Israel for every evil. The most recent one is I saw something that talked about, you know, a mayor within the West Bank started saying that the IDF is shaping bombs as toys so that Palestinian kids will pick them up. Stop the incitement and acknowledge, you know, you don't have Abu Mazen allow, which he did 2 months ago, for a statement to be issued in his name where he referred to the temple as the alleged temple in Jerusalem. Stop the incitement. Fourth step, prepare your public for peace. Now, Arafat used to say to me all the time in our meetings, he wasn't asking for the moon. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not asking for the moon. I'm not asking for the Palestinians to be ready to detail the concessions they're going to make. All I want them to do is use the other Arafat template, which was Peace of the Brave. And under the template of Peace of the Brave, make it clear, the meaning of the Peace of the Brave is that both sides have hard decisions to make. Not just the Israelis, but Palestinians too. So that's the fifth step, or at least the fifth point on the agenda. Sixth point on the agenda is I want the Palestinians to continue with the Fayyad plan, which is to say, build your state without encroaching on Israel, and to deal with actually one of the biggest sources of discontent in the West Bank today, which is not related to Israel, but it's related to the Palestinian Authority, and it's to the corruption that is perceived in the Palestinian Authority. Focus on institutions that relate to building the rule of law, which also has the benefit of sending a message to the Israeli public about the kind of neighbor you're prepared to be. All right, 12 points, 6 and 6. Now, what are the last 4? There is no contact between the two societies today. The only Israelis that Palestinian kids see are Israeli soldiers. And I can assure you when they see them, it's not a really wonderful exchange. And Palestinian and Israeli kids, they don't see Palestinians. And you had, you know, a couple of months ago, you actually had a lynching of a Palestinian by Israeli kids who actually just were put on trial. And if you look at their Facebook entries, they were really ugly. Well, it's pretty easy to demonize and dehumanize when there's no contact. So again, the 7th point for each on this agenda is that they should commit to a readiness to create an exchange of youth. And I would start it young, you know, an exchange of 3rd graders. Create some kind of systematic exchange, be open to the idea that you're going to begin to create a kind of socialization of young people where they can meet each other. It becomes a whole lot harder to demonize when you have contact. Now, the 8th step is neither side will ever acknowledge when the other does something positive. So a commitment that they'll each acknowledge publicly what the other does that's positive. In private, you'll hear the IDF talk about, you know, how the Palestinian security forces are professional and fulfill their obligations. You sure don't hear that in public.
Oh, yes, you do.
You don't hear from the Israeli. You do not hear from the Israeli government. You do not hear from the Israeli government that. You do not. If you did, there'd be more focus on making sure they get paid. And on the Palestinian side, you know, the whole issue of the taxes. It's an Israeli obligation, but what isn't an Israeli obligation, which, by the way, this Israeli government has done, is to give early advances on the money, which they have done repeatedly, particularly because of the shortfalls and the fact that the Arabs are not fulfilling their promises. So they've done that, but you never get any acknowledgement of that. Or for the fact, you know, Hadassah Hospital, you know, it treats any Palestinian need without charge. Do you ever hear a public acknowledgement of that? Which, by the way, would show something about, again, the humanity of the other side? You do not. So it's time, and by the way, these are examples, but my point is, I want each side, as part of this 16-point agenda, I want them, these last 2 points should be mutual, where they agree, once they begin this discussion, that these are things that they will do. Now, obviously, the other 12 points, they can mix and match, and they can decide, you know, if you do this, this is what we'll do. Now, this is not a substitute for negotiating on the core issues, but I can assure you that if tomorrow you had a negotiation on the core issues, it would go nowhere. There needs to be a political basis for those discussions. I would say the President Obama's 2 speeches in May of 2011 could provide the political basis. But this agenda represents a focal point for discussions, and if you actually began to do something on it, you'd create a virtuous cycle, which we have not had. Basically, we haven't had it since the beginning of Oslo.
So I'm determined to break this forging coalition here and let Dr. Schueftan respond to, I think specifically to the last 4 points, I guess.
Well, first of all, I don't have any problem with the requirements from Israel. I think it's a good idea, and we can proceed on this. Concerning the requirements from the Palestinians, there are actually 4 different ways of saying stop the incitement. It's one thing. But you wanted probably the same number of points, so you know you made it 4. And by far, the one thing that is more important than everything combined isn't there, and that's the right of return. Because what Israelis realize is that since it didn't work to destroy Israel by violence, you do it through demography. And my problem is that it is what the Israelis really want, but it's what the Palestinians will not give, no matter what you do. So when you present it to the Israelis, I think they will come to this, and this will break the whole system, not because of what you require from the Israelis, but because of what you don't require from the Palestinians. And the last point, please, if you can forget about this idea of Israelis and Palestinians knowing each other from kindergarten level and so on. That's very nice. That's a Shimon Peres approach. The more Israelis and Palestinians know each other, the less they like each other. And I think the best thing, I would cut them off for 50 years and then they can start speaking if they don't remember each other anymore. It sounds great, and the better it sounds, the worse it is. But as an Israeli, I'm telling you, I don't think that Israel should have any problem with the requirements from Israel, and if we can address what the Israelis are concerned about on the Palestinian side, it would be more helpful.
Look, here's, I want to respond.
Please, yeah.
All right, so you got some dissonance between us, so you were successful. No, look, here's the problem.
And look who's watching you.
No, here's,
yes.
Here's,
as always.
Here's the, shocking. Here's the problem I have with your response. On the Israeli side, none of the things that I've identified go to the core of the problem. Right. On the Palestinian side, you're asking them to concede on the core of the problem. Palestinians would say that, look, you want me to concede on the core of the problem? You concede on Jerusalem.
But we're not symmetric.
No, all right.
We have occupied them.
That's fine. But I'm saying that for the Palestinians to concede on the right of return, but they don't see any concession from the Israelis on Jerusalem, it won't fly. Oh. And the fact is, if the Israelis are prepared to do the kind of things that I suggested, which I think they could be, I do think, look, putting Israel on a map, that's a way of demonstrating an intention. Starting to talk about 2 states for 2 peoples, that's a way of acknowledging something. All right, does it fulfill everything? No, it doesn't fulfill everything, but we're not solving the conflict. We're trying to change the dynamic.
I want to actually to address a question to you on a slightly different topic still around this Israel-Palestinian issue, and I would like also to hear Dr. Schueftan and Ambassador Ross' notes on that, but we really have to be brief because there are a lot of questions and I still want to give the audience a chance to ask questions as well. I want to ask you, Ghaith, as a person who worked closely with Mahmoud Abbas, the President of the Palestinian Authority, I would like to ask you, who is President Abbas? On the one hand, the President describes himself as a man of peace, committed to fight terror and violence. Under my term, there will be no armed intifada or an uprising, he recently said. He portrays himself as a leader who adheres to the two-state solutions. For me, Palestine is in the 1967 borders. All the rest is Israel, he told the Israeli media last month. On the other hand, in his speech to the United Nations General Assembly on September 2012, he venomously attacked Israel as committing ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In recent speeches to the Palestinian people, President Abbas avoided all mention of historic agreements with Israel. Instead, he re-emphasized the path of struggle to realize the dream of return of the Palestinian refugees and their millions of descendants, and referred to Palestinian militants who killed many Israeli civilians and are classified by Israel as terrorists as a source of inspiration for the Palestinian people. So who is President Abbas? Is he a reliable partner for peace, as he portrays himself? Or, if to quote some hawkish Israeli politicians, a militant dressed up in a Hugo Boss suit? And I will start with you, and I would also would like to have your comments briefly, please.
After years in working in government, I learned that you take the question, you don't have to answer it. So, before I get to that, let me just touch on what Dan and Dennis talked about.
Okay. It's a good lawyer, yeah.
Yes, a good lawyer and a former diplomat. My issue, first of all, I agree with you, Dennis, that the issue of refugees, put it out there, then you were back to permanent status. We have basically failed to do what this is intended to do. My problem, Dennis, with that is how you frame it and how you present it. If you present it as a bilateral process, then we will immediately put Palestinians and Israelis opposite one another, and they will start the process of upmanship. And it will end up with, what are you going to give me to do something that's good for myself? And this is so that's why I'm more enamored, more interested in the kind of arrangement that are brokered by the US, preferably bilateral, American-Israeli, American-Palestinian, because that brings the second issue, which is what is the price of non-compliance? So far, frankly, touching on your issue, we hear some very nasty statements by whether it's Abbas or Lieberman or many others, because there is zero political cost for that. Domestically, you get kudos for it. Foreign policy, you get nothing. And frankly, during the Clinton administration, when you guys were there was a political price for... and it's difficult to do that in a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli. This is where the US can be inserted in a very interesting way. So in a sense, for the logic of what you are presenting, I see, now the word unilateralism is a dirty word, but coordinated unilateralism, arrangements, what have you, this is, I think, how we can move rather than let the two sides argue it to death. Who is Abu Mazen? On the one hand, I can say very, very comfortably and very, with good conscience that he is a man who completely is against violence. I think this is internalized. I am critical of him, and you'll see that in many ways. But I think on this issue, it was very clear when I worked for him when he was Prime Minister. There was a moment when we had a summit at Aqaba between him and Bush, and Sharon was the Prime Minister then. And frankly, he was willing to say things that cost him his position. The things that he said in the speech that he wrote, and I know I was part of that, and we got a lot of pushback to kind of make it more militant. He chose to go for ending violence, etc., because he deeply believes it. So I think in that regard, he is someone who believes in a two-state solution and believes in doing this without violence. But at the same time, he is someone who has lost faith, has lost his belief. He doesn't trust Netanyahu at all. And he is, and there is kind of history and baggage going back to the first Netanyahu administration. And he is also, I think, like Netanyahu and like many in the region right now, he is a risk-averse politician. He is the kind of politician, frankly, who would rather have the status quo that has no immediate pain than take sometimes a difficult decision that he is not sure will produce results. So I think it's a combination of that. Today, I think he is someone who is tired. I think he sees no future. He doesn't trust the Israeli Prime Minister in particular. And he doesn't really trust President Obama after the first term. And on the other hand, he is someone who is very secure where he is. There is no political opposition to him within his, at least in the political echelons in Palestine. And he has done a lot, by the way, to ensure that that is the case. He is not allowing a rejuvenation of the Palestinian political system because he gains out of it. So he is someone who is there. He is someone, if you want to move him, you're not going to, I wouldn't expect from him a Sadat-like gesture or a Hussein-like gesture, but he is someone like Netanyahu who can be managed and who can be nudged, bribed, arm-twisted, etc., to get to a point that is comfortable. So that is, that is where he is. One last point about him to kind of add to the lack of security. He is a very lonely person right now, regionally speaking. Regionally speaking. Mubarak, who was basically it, is gone.
I'll go back to that also in a specific question, but please.
Relations with Jordan are very bad. The Saudis are not really helping, or they have issues with him. The Emiratis the same. So he finds himself in a very lonely place and becoming less influenceable when it comes to that. And I think many of the levers that we usually use to influence and engage politicians, we see these moving away from him. So,
you know, I will actually maybe build up on that now and then allow Ambassador Ross and Dr. Schueftan to add if they have any more comments. I want to ask you, when you see a senior Turkish delegation visits Gaza after the last Israeli operation, they're headed by Ahmed Davutoglu. One of the delegates was also the son of Prime Minister Erdogan, was Bilal Erdogan. When the Qatari Emir, as you just mentioned, Hamad bin Khalifa Thani, comes to Gaza, writes off a check of half a million US dollars to Hamas, billion, you're right, to Hamas. What does it tell you? What does it tell us? Have the Muslim world gave up on the Palestinian Authority and the 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank? Does it leave the Palestinian people at the hands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad? What does it tell us? What is the message?
It tells us there are, really three, but I would say two main axes developing in the Arab world. I'm not going to talk about the Shia axis. I'm going to talk about within the Sunni Muslim Arab world. I would say you have two axes. You have an axis that is Muslim Brotherhood oriented, that wants the Islamists to come to power, that is willing to be tactically accommodationist like Morsi, but ultimately the objective is to have a Muslim Brotherhood style leadership in the Arab world. And frankly, Qatar has bankrolled a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood movements, including in Egypt and elsewhere, and it's doing the same with Hamas. Turkey is giving a lot of the kind of political space for Hamas, and Egypt, I think, will continue pushing for reconciliation based on terms that are better for Hamas. So we see this one trend, and frankly, advocates and participants of this trend, they are agile, they put their money where their mouth is, and at the end of the day, they are responsive. They quickly can take a benefit or control and use of a situation to the benefit of their ally, in this particular case, Hamas. On the other hand, you have the, if you wish, the traditional pro-Western, I don't know what the term I would use for them, whether it's the Gulf, whether it's Jordan, whether some of those who feel a little bit beleaguered and threatened, who have their own gripes with the US that is not allowing them to, it's diminishing US leadership, which has often been key in terms of organizing Arab behavior. And they are not very responsive. They are old, literally and figuratively. And the problem with that, if I were to be a pure analyst, I would say I would bet on the Islamists to kind of ride the wave. If I'm someone with a degree of interest, whether in terms of US future national interest or the interest of people like myself in the region, I would say this is not a far-gone conclusion, and I think there is a lot that can be done to force the Islamists to deal with some of the issues that they have to deal with. We should never, again, allow Morsi to accumulate so much credit with us in the Gaza war to spend it immediately the next day on passing constitutional issues that are very problematic. So I think what you have right now is, I don't know if you want to call it civilizational clash there, but we definitely have a clash of paradigms. And one of the paradigms is going to win and define the region. Okay. Hamas is just kind of, you know, a pivot in this whole thing.
Any additions on your part before we shift a little bit to Iran?
Yeah. 2 points. First, a comment on his earlier comment. You know, I still believe it's worth trying a negotiation, but I also believe it shouldn't be bilateral at this point. I mean, what I mean by that is the U.S. should play a role. I still favor bilateral negotiations, but either you take the 16 points and make it an agenda for discussions, or the U.S. should become the broker of the 16 points. We need to do something to change the dynamic, because if we don't, you can see where this is headed. Now, the second point, I mean, now you drive us back into our convergence again. The one interesting thing I would add to what Ray said, you know, I'm doing a book right now, and the first part of it is historical, and I can't help but remind our here and on the stage, in the 1950s and 60s, you also had a competition between the Egyptians and the Saudis. You had a lineup that in some ways is different than today, but has certain similarities as well. There's if you look at this kind of the Muslim Brotherhood coalition, it is Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar. Qatar has the money. The Turks right now, the AKP party, has a demonstration of effectiveness, which is not unimportant because there is no successful model right now in the region. So to the extent to which you could have a model that looks to be successful, it can create a magnet of attraction. Egypt, though, Egypt has to demonstrate that it can be successful, and it's a very long ways away from doing that. And you have pitted against them basically Jordan, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, most of the other Gulf states except for Qatar. And the Palestinians should be a part of that. I mean, the Palestinian Authority should be a part of that coalition versus the Hamas, because Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not, they are organically linked. They are the Muslim Brotherhood. So the point here is, you know, we have a stake in what happens in terms of the future identity of the region. And we're going to have to think hard about this because it's, you know, we have a set of values which we should continue to emphasize. We also have a stake in how the competition between these two emerging coalitions is going to play out. And here's where American values need to be an important part of how we deal with Egypt, because they need to respect minority rights for their own interest, by the way, also. They need to preserve political pluralism. They need to preserve and respect women's rights, because if they exclude you know, half their population, they're not going to be a successful society. Now, when I say that, you could say, well, and then how does that relate to your support of the other coalition? And the answer is, you know, you support your values, but you also have to deal on a case-by-case basis. This gets back to Dan's point. You know, you want perfect consistency, you write it in your books. Mm-hmm. You want perfect consistency when it comes to conducting foreign policy, it's an impossibility. So, you know, the idea is to create concepts from your books that can be applied in a practical way. Understanding the history here is quite important. The late Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration reached out to Nasser in a way that presumed that we could transform Nasser's identity, and we could not. We cannot transform the Muslim Brotherhood's identity. We could have influenced Nasser's behavior to some extent, and we can influence the behavior of the Muslim Brotherhood to some extent. We need to understand the floor below which we don't want things to go. We also need to understand there's a ceiling above which things will not go.
Do you have anything to add before I jump to Iran and then we kind of concluding?
Two very short comments.
Yes.
First, notice we started with the question of the impact of the Israeli elections over the region, And we ended up speaking about what we can do on the Palestinian issue, a little here, a little there. So if anybody comes back to the very bizarre notion of the beginning of the Obama administration, that you just settle the Palestinian question and the Middle East will become more stable and so on, I hope we are not coming back to it. Second, concerning the question you presented to Ghaith about Abu Mazen, and I would also expand it to Salam Fayyad. The problem is not with the personality, and I'm not so interested with in the personality. You know, the question what the person really is, what is really deep in his heart, we should address to cardiologists, not to people who deal with political affairs. I'm not interested in what he really is. I'm interested in the question, what can he deliver? And unfortunately, not Salam Fayyad and not Abu Mazen can deliver whatever he wants. He can't deliver. He's not a Palestinian leader. He can get things. He cannot give things. Because when he will approach his people to speak about the right of return, I don't think they'll even bother to kill him. They will simply have a good laugh. And when you go even deeper than Salam Fayyad, than Abu Mazen to Salam Fayyad, I don't see anything about Salam Fayyad that I don't like. I mean, here is a person that is the first Palestinian leader since the beginning of the Palestinian people that is really concerned about building his own society. It's the best thing that could have happened to Palestinians. But Salam Fayyad, again, cannot deliver anything. He's not even a hologram. He's an unconfirmed rumor. I like him. I like him very much, and I wish he will succeed. And actually, what I would want to see is Salam Fayyad going ahead with his unilateral approach, and Israel matching it with its own unilateral approach, and we will have some coordinated unilateralism. That's fine. But if you expect Salam Fayyad or Abu Mazen to deliver what the Israelis really need from the Palestinians, I don't think that when push comes to shove, they can do it.
Okay. In 2 minutes, I want to touch with you, Ambassador Ross, on Iran, and then the last question we open for like 10 minutes to the audience for questions. On Iran, on the one hand, Mr. Chuck Hagel, President Obama's nominee for Secretary of Defense, has opposed unilateral sanctions on Iran and declared that he is prepared to contain a nuclear Iran. On the other hand, we probably have Prime Minister Netanyahu, that will be re-elected after these elections, considers a nuclear Iran as an existential threat to Israel, and declared last week when he met with American congressmen in Israel that his priority will be first to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So does President Obama, by nominating Mr. Hagel, and if he passes, of course, the nomination to Secretary of Defense, implies on where President Obama plans to go on the Iranian issue?
Let's be clear about what Senator Hagel has said, and I've actually spoken to him about this. He never supported containment as an option, never. He gave a speech, he told me back in 2006, where he talked about the options that were available, of which containment was an option, but he was doing that analytically and not in support of it. And he told me unmistakably he favors prevention as the objective, understands the strategy of the administration, that it has been pressure and prevention as the objective, and he wholeheartedly embraces that. So I take him at his word. And so I don't see this as being inconsistent. Let's understand, the President of the United States made a decision on the objective. The objective was prevention, not containment. I was part of, this was debated within the first term of the administration. I was a part of that debate. He made a conscious decision. This is not a president who makes impulsive decisions. This is a president who makes decisions after he's thought about it. And there was a debate on this issue. Those who favored containment said, look, we've done it with others. Why can't we do it? Why can't we live with this and then just deter it? And the answer to it was because it won't work. Containment will not prevent the Saudis from deciding they have to have a nuclear weapon to offset what the Iranians have. Bear in mind, the Obama administration would be the third administration that has said Iran can't have this. First it was Clinton, then it was Bush, then Obama. So which country in the Middle East is going to say, after having 3 administrations declare this, and the Iranians somehow succeed in it, which administrations then, which country in the region is going to say, gee, we'll take your assurance now? I mean, it's not going to happen. And the Saudis, for their own reasons, are not going to allow themselves to be put in a position where they are put at such a disadvantage with their main competitor, in every conceivable sense, their main competitor. So containment won't prevent that, and then it won't create the equivalent of a stable balance of terror. During the Cold War, by the way, we were a lot closer to nuclear war than we realized a couple of times, but at least we and the Soviets each knew that we couldn't disarm the other. In the Middle East, countries that go nuclear will assume they can't afford to strike second. It means they'll have their finger on the trigger. It means you'll end up with a high probability of a nuclear war. Containment doesn't prevent that. So the president made a decision. The objective is prevention. He wants to achieve this through diplomatic means. Anybody, who I think has the responsibility he has would want to achieve it through peaceful means. But if it can't be achieved through peaceful means, then it makes the use of force quite likely. And my impression is that is very clearly the position of the administration, and that will be the position of Senator Hagel when he becomes the Secretary of Defense. So I don't see a gap between the United States and Israel on the issue of the objective. As I said, where you have a potential will be, does the issue of the zone of immunity come back on the Israeli side after it's been submerged? Because then the question will be, look, we, Israel, are running out of time. You're engaged in a diplomatic process that, we don't know if the Iranians will ever do anything except play rope-a-dope with you. And if that's the case, we can't afford for diplomacy to go on past the point where we lose our option. So the issue will come back. I think the issue will come back in the spring, but this is something that I believe the administration can manage with the new Israeli government.
So, last question is really a 1 minute for each and one of you. We still talk about the election, so let's wrap it up like this. When the Israeli voter hears Turkey's leaders attack Israel, when the Muslim world wooing after Hamas, when Egypt is led by an Islamist party, when Syria is flooded with jihadist militants, when Iran advances with little disruption with its nuclear program, when the Israeli voter hears President Abbas zigzags between declarations for peace to attacking Israel, the Israeli voter is at a political crossroad. He asks himself, he or she of course, does peace and normalization in this region are even possible? Or better, to go and vote for parties and candidates that focus all their efforts on security rather than engagement. If you had a chance to speak to the average Israeli voter who goes to vote in 8 days from now, 7 days Israeli time, what would you tell him? Where should he see the ray of hope? So 1 minute to each and one of you. Right, we haven't heard you for a while. Let's start with you.
Wow, 1 minute ray of hope.
I have a clock here, yes.
There's none? No, I'm joking. I would say the following. Look at where your interest lies and work based on that. I think we often put polar opposites between diplomacy and security, and I think this is a very mistaken idea. How do you reformulate your relations with the surroundings based on the one hand, very strong security requirements, as we see with Egypt, and make sure that they stick. But on the other hand, there is space for progress, because if there is no progress, you'll continue to be isolated. It is this balance that I would like to look for, and this is what I would advocate for any Israeli voter. Just look at the balance between the real security needs, but at the same time, the strategic need to engage, otherwise you're overwhelmed just by sheer numbers in the future.
Dr. Schueftan?
If you're looking for hope, don't look for it in the Middle East.
I thought you were going to say vote Shas or something.
There is a limit. I won't even joke about this because I consider this to be the curse of the Jewish people. But if you're looking for hope, don't look for it in the Middle East. Strengthen the two most important things for Israel, and this is the Israeli society and the relations with the United States.
Please, Ambassador.
I think both those are very good messages. I would add just one on top of it. Keep your focus and demand of those who are governing you to keep their focus on the essence of the Zionist dream, which is to preserve Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And those who would not assume the responsibility to preserve Israel as a Jewish democratic state are not ultimately serving the strategic interests of Israel.
Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate all your analysis here.